Thank you for the very kind introduction, and I would, of course, also like to thank the organizers for having invited me to participate in this important discussion. It's a great pleasure and honor for me. I see my role in the discussion a bit to bring in the perspective of states strongly supporting nuclear disarmament, but unlike Germany and Japan, highly skeptical about the security value of nuclear weapons and of an international security system underpinned by nuclear deterrence. So the perspective of states such as Austria that supported the TPNW and its underlying rationale that the humanitarian consequences are too grave, the risks are too complex and too serious, and that moving away from reliance on nuclear weapons is an urgent priority. So I have to say I disagree with the notion that we have to solve all other global issues first, because before we can consider nuclear disarmament, it is one of the most urgent and pressing issues that the international community faces. So consequently, from that logic, setting the legal norm to comprehensively prohibit these weapons is a necessary step, and it also provides the legal basis from which other more urgent and concrete steps need to be taken. But I want to focus on a few other issues. When we talk about nuclear dynamics, we put nuclear weapons into the security context and we talk about them as a security issue. But that's, of course, only half of the story, because it's also very much a political issue. It has to be seen in a political context, and we've moved globally and certainly also in Europe backwards in the nuclear dynamics in the past few years in a more dangerous and deteriorating situation. We see the deterioration of relations between NATO and Russia, the invasion of Ukraine, the illegal annexation of Crimea, Russia taking destabilizing actions in other regional contexts, is at the origins of hybrid threats from disinformation to cyber attacks. And in the nuclear field, we see a more aggressive rhetoric, even open nuclear threats, including by the president himself, and the development of new types of nuclear weapons that are seen as highly dangerous and destabilizing. And these actions are, of course, given as reasons why NATO also thinks it must display a robust nuclear posture, and why nuclear deterrence is seen as still a backbone of NATO's collective defense. Russia, of course, has its own narrative, threat perceptions, encirclement by NATO, eastwards enlargement of NATO, ballistic missile defenses, and so on. So this dynamic has brought us back to the brink of a nuclear arms race, if we are not already in the middle of one. But these negative dynamics are not merely the result of developments in the security field. I would say that Russia, for example, has a clear political interest in playing up the nuclear weapons dimension and highlighting its nuclear power status. It's the one area where the notion of operating as a superpower at a par level with the United States can be maintained. This is of great political and including domestic political interest by those in Russia who regret the decline of what used to be the Soviet Union. But of course, the situation today is completely different compared to the Cold War. Simply looking at military power, the US in 2019 spent 20-fold compared to what Russia spent on defense. And if you add the military defense spending of US allies, the picture is even starker. So I think the question can be asked, what is then the actual threat that Russia poses to NATO states, for which nuclear weapons are the right response and an effective deterrent? Would nuclear weapons have prevented the incursion of green men, as was the case in Ukraine? Are nuclear weapons the right response to deter, let alone to respond to hybrid threats? I'm not trying to play down the threat perceptions that countries, for instance, in the east of NATO, have vis-a-vis Russia. They're based, of course, on deep-seated historical experiences and grievances. But what exactly are the scenarios for NATO states coming from Russia that nuclear weapons are expected to deter Russia from doing? I think these are legitimate questions. Are we talking about the full-scale invasion of NATO states by Russia? Is there anyone who considers this as a realistic scenario? Rather, there is a political dimension to it, probably very understandable, a political desire, for example, in Eastern NATO countries, to have nuclear weapons included in the defense mix as a demonstration of strength. So it's a political issue rather than based on an actual threat scenario for which nuclear weapons are an effective answer. One can even argue, I would say, that by responding to Russia's actions with a re-emphasis on nuclear weapons, one's actually doing Russia a political favor by underscoring a superpower status that Russia in reality no longer possesses. NATO has stated that as long nuclear weapons exists, NATO will remain a nuclear alliance. But of course, given NATO's preeminent role and positions, other nuclear weapon states are unlikely to move away from nuclear weapons unless NATO takes such credible steps. So the corollary of this NATO statement is that nuclear weapons will exist as long as NATO remains a nuclear alliance. So this statement, in a way, cements the status quo and prevents moving away and prevents moving progress on nuclear disarmament. So I would make the argument that NATO, given its preeminent role, would have the clout and would have the potential to de-emphasize nuclear weapons and to move away from nuclear deterrence and strengthen and develop other forms of deterrence, because extended deterrence, of course, is not necessarily extended nuclear deterrence. And looking at the concrete threats that US allies face, I think at least the discussion should be had if other forms of deterrence are not more likely to be more practical, more effective, and more credible than the threat of mutually assured destructions, which, by the way, of course, has absolutely no public support in our countries. The threat of inflicting unacceptable consequences on civilian populations is seen as anachronistic and fully out of sync with public opinion. And of course, the threat alone does not deter, because nuclear deterrence depends necessarily on the credible actual use of nuclear weapons. And this latter part of the equation is usually omitted in the nuclear weapons discourse. Then another important dimension, the reliance on nuclear deterrence actually means that we are about to lose the fight against non-proliferation. DPRK is a prime example of this, of course, but also in the Middle East context, we are threatened by a cascade of nuclear proliferation with Iran, of course, but Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, and possibly others. So for me, this underscores unequivocally that one cannot in the long run insist on the value of nuclear weapons for one's own defense, and at the same time, credibly and effectively stop other states from wanting to go down the same route. There are other political aspects. Nuclear weapons in Europe symbolize US engagement in European defense. And of course, in the past few years, there were lots of fears in Europe that the US would disengage from NATO. So the nuclear weapons issue, I think, needs to be also seen in this larger political question on the future of NATO and on the future of US engagement in Europe. And of course, the whole issue of defense spending is also part of this. So I'm making the point that that nuclear weapons issue are often mixed up in both security dimension, but also very much political aspects. On the state of play, I agree with everything that was said before by Professor Thakur. The TPNW is a reaction to the loss of credibility of nuclear disarmament and in the NPT. So the idea of an NPT-based disarmament process has lost its credibility, given that the much celebrated agreements in 2000 and 2010 have been ignored. I think nuclear weapon states have yet to fully understand and appreciate the extent to which the lack of credible progress has created a fundamental trust and credibility deficit. The fact that the CTBT has little prospect of entry into force, of course, adds to this. This is a problem for Europe in particular, and I would guess the same goes for Japan, who have a strong interest in maintaining multilateralism and the rule of law. The EU has multilateralism in its DNA. But I think this credibility deficit can only be addressed by addressing the nuclear disarmament dimension. And Germany and Japan, of course, are strong supporters of multilateralism and of nuclear disarmament, but the fact that they also rely on extended nuclear deterrence, that has come certainly into focus in the discussion in the process leading up to the TPNW. Many non-aligned states make the point frequently, challenge, for example, to what extent nuclear sharing is compatible with the NPT. and it's put in contrast with a self-declared image to support nuclear disarmament and defending the credibility of the multilateral system in the context of nuclear weapons. So the stance is a bit reminiscent of what we see in the Brexit debate of having the cake and eating it at the same time. So I think what we would need is a discussion. My last point, I think we need to differentiate in the nuclear weapons discourse more between those aspects in the debate that are more political when it comes to nuclear weapons and those that are actually related to real security threats and issues, and to see what concrete scenarios nuclear weapons do play a role, instead of falling back to applying nuclear deterrence concepts of the last century to the situation in the 21st century. So I think we need to have a broad and inclusive dialogue on nuclear deterrence. And I would hope, and I think Germany and Japan could play a lead role in that, in strengthening the taboo against nuclear weapons and the discussion on nuclear deterrence, about the veracity of nuclear deterrence as a basis of international peace and security in the 21st century, about the underlying assumptions of nuclear deterrence, from rationality to stability to predictability, on which nuclear deterrence is based. A discussion that weighs the humanitarian consequences and risks of nuclear weapons against the assumed security benefits. And I would also, coming from Austria and having seen the very negative reactions to the TPNW, I would hope that Germany and Japan could lead the change to move away from the adversarial approach currently on display against the TPNW and its supporters, and rather take the underlying arguments and the global threat perceptions that are the result of the possession of nuclear weapons and of the collective practice of nuclear deterrence to take it more seriously. So I think we need this discussion about a concrete discussion about the validity of nuclear deterrence in the 21st century. Thank you very much.